sermon title this morning is The Fourth Day. God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and seasons, and for days and years. And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heavens, to give light on the earth." And it was so. Then God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. God set them in the firmament of the heavens to give light on the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. So the evening and the morning were the fourth day. Amen. John Conant said in his sermon, he was a Puritan pastor, and he said in his sermon on John 17:3, sermon number 4 on John 17, verse 3. So, don't think I've ever preached 4 consecutive sermons on one verse, but maybe we'll get there someday. This is what he says: "The heavens, by their unwearied and perpetual motion, ride in a circuit about the earth and compass it every day, since the one and the other had a being, without cessation or intermission. How great a work must it appear to be to any man that shall take it into his serious consideration. And how convincing an argument that there is a supreme, most wise, and powerful being that hath made these things and given such laws to them, as that they cannot but keep their stations, and remain where the author of their being hath placed them, and go on in that course he hath appointed for them." So often we take for granted. In fact, we see the nature as maybe not pointing to God. In our modern world, we've devised a way of seeing nature as not pointing to God, pointing to modern and secular theories of the world. But since the beginning of the world, we have always been able to see God through his works, through these providential acts, that we have a created universe, a solar system that is appointed in such a way that it is constant, that it continues. And we are in awe of it. We are rightly in awe of it. But then there are the secular views, the atheist views of how the world should work. And I want you to put yourself in Rochester, New York in the 1920s, where a technology company called Kodak, which was a pioneer in the area of photography. Kodak was a company started by George Eastman, and he wanted to revolutionize and modernize the work week, because this was the Industrial Revolution. At the end of the 1800s, in the beginning of the 1900s, we were going to revolutionize the world through industry, through production, through technology. Does that sound familiar? That now the world is a different place than ever before because of technology. And what did George Eastman want to do? In 1928, he wanted, and he did, introduce the Kodak International Fixed Calendar, which proposed a 13-month year, so one more month, he added, with each month consisting of 28 days, divided into 4 weeks of 7 days each. At least he got that part right. This calendar aimed to streamline business operations, increase productivity, and it was a radical change to our traditional calendar. It proposed a perpetual calendar that would disrupt what we had always known, or not always known, but we had known in the Christian world since the days of Gregory, the Gregorian calendar, Gregory the Great. And so this attempt to alter the calendar is not George Eastman's mania alone. There have been others. About 100 years earlier, shortly after the American Revolution, the French Revolution, around 1793, so just before 1800, their revolutionary secular government, keep in mind our American Revolution was firmly ingrained in Christian heritage and Christian values, but the French Revolution, which followed right afterwards, was a secular revolution. It introduced the French Republican calendar, and this replaced entirely the Gregorian calendar, the calendar of Gregory, which was our Christian calendar. And this new system divided the year into 12 months of 30 days each, which sounds more normal than the 13 months of George Eastman, but hold on to your hats, it gets weird. With each month split into 3 10-day weeks. 3 10-day weeks. And these were called decades. So it wasn't a week, it was a decade. So that's definitely a re-understanding of time, but the French pronunciation, décades, or I'm not sure how to pronounce French. So the goal was to secularize time and to remove the influence of the church. Many Christians were killed in the French Revolution, but ultimately this failed due to resistance, and it was just not practical. And that's why we don't, good Christian countries like England, the United States, we don't use the metric system based on tens. It's ungodly. That's a joke. But definitely the 10-day weeks is ungodly. So then about 100 years later, closer to the time of George Eastman, you kind of have to wonder about his political allegiances. I haven't looked into his life that closely, but in 1929, in the Soviet Union, the 5-day work week was introduced. This was Joseph Stalin's system, and it was a system where he divided workers into 5 groups, each working a different set of days and shifts. And then to maximize industrial output without burning people out, well, he burned the system out in 1940, which you can see is a mere 11 years later, that system broke down. And even though it was the perfect humanitarian answer to the Christian calendar, it just didn't work. And these examples highlight our human attempt to defy a 7-day week, a pattern that's been set by God since creation. And we are going to look at this 4th day, the setting of the celestial lights in the heavens, the sun, moon, and the stars, the governing of the time and the seasons, not just the 7 days, but also how we understand the whole year, the seasons, and how they work and how they inform our agriculture, our planning, our business cycles. Even navigating different times of years would have been, if you're navigating in the sea on a ship, you have to be conscious of what time of year it is and the weather and the seasons that come with the the changing of the temperatures. And so to change this order should be unthinkable to us. And it is unthinkable to most of us, except for the most radical of us. And this is how we normally treat things as Christians. We say, those homosexuals, they'll never get their own type of marriage because it's not legitimate. And then somehow they convince people that this is the humanitarian way. And we laugh and we scoff and we say, they'll never change the calendar. And then 10 or 20 years from now, they'll try to change the calendar and update it into the new International American calendar, right? So that we can all be Americans. Maybe that's a prophetic utterance. I don't know. It's not intended to be. But we think, before these things happen, before the revolutionaries come, that it would be impossible. I'm sure the French kings thought it would be impossible for there to ever be anything. The French kings were always very powerful. Read Alexis de Tocqueville. He says that the French police force is unlike the American police force because they were very top down and there was a lot of control that they had in their country. They would never think that anything like a revolution would be able to happen. And then not long after, dear Alexis was proven wrong. The French monarchy crumbled into total chaos. So we're going to look at the day 4 of creation as also a day that is foreshadowing the worship that God intends for us to understand as implicit in creation. That this is actually a foreshadowing that Moses later brings out in the temple. But we're also going to look at the structure of the whole of creation, which I've hinted at in past sermons, but we're going to look at a little more closely how the chiastic structure of this laying out of creation by the 7 days, how this helps us understand both the creation and the population of creation, and how each of the days stands out in its own right. So we did cover last week that God is the divider. And we see the continuation of that here, that God said, let there be lights in the firmament to divide, for the purpose of dividing the day from the night. Let them be for signs and seasons and days and years. And we're going to talk about how we should understand constellations and astronomy and astrology and what is the right way. I will focus primarily on verses 14 through 19, but we are going to look at the whole of the creation account as well. So God divides, he creates the luminaries on the 4th day, and this demonstrates his role, that he is the separator of light from darkness, day and night. He establishes order in the creation in doing this, and this is a reflection of him bringing order from chaos, and he is one who governs with wisdom. And so we worship him for this. In the scriptures, we see Isaiah 45 relating back to the 4th day. In Isaiah, he says, I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create calamity. I, the Lord, do all these things. He's emphasizing his sovereignty over his creation. And there are some people who say, well, I know that God predestines people to salvation, but can we say that God is damning people to hell? Can we say that God is wishing for bad things to happen? Do I not have a free will to choose and decide? We don't believe in a God who merely and illogically passes over some into reprobation as if that's not a part of his will. He saves some and he passes over others, but logically it is God's will, and this verse reminds us of that. And we should fear God that he would pass us over, and we should cry out to him, Lord, save me, as if he would pass you over. Not that you can change the predestining will of God, but this is what we see many times in Scripture. Lord, I believe, help me in my unbelief. Save me without your sovereign will over creation, over light and darkness, peace and calamity, predestination and reprobation. Lord, without your will, I am lost. And that is the type of humility that we seek to have. Even as we approach this God of creation and we see what is natural in his being, that he is a God who predestines to salvation, but also logically passing over others. So the nature of God here is that he establishes an order that we have to live in, and that he is sovereign over that order. And that, Christians, should motivate your prayers more than anything. The idea that we would believe in a determinism in which would cause us to not pray is unthinkable. It's unthinkable that you would approach a sovereign God who has power over everything, who can clear your slate, and that you would not approach him with a heart that cries out for mercy and grace, knowing that he is a God who loves to give mercy and grace. The idea that you would think that the doctrine of predestination requires you to not pray is wicked and evil, and we should reject it outright. This is the God who has not only appointed the light and the darkness, but he's appointed the moons for the seasons, and the sun knows it's going down. In the Psalm 104, it points out that he has ordained the moon and the sun. He has power over them. Even in the Psalms, it's referring back to creation. And so I ask you, Christian, if you don't believe in day 4, if you don't believe in the creation of day 4, can you believe in Psalm 104? Which is clearly stating the same thing, that God has appointed in day 4 the sun and the moon for seasons. He knows and has appointed everything that continues on in creation. One of the things that we do need to address is this idea that we have a literal 6 days, and we've been addressing this, and we need to address it multiple times so that we can get it straight. But can you have a foreshadowing of the temple? Can there be a foreshadowing of the temple that we see here? E.J. Young says that we see the days as literal 6 days, but they can be also analogical, meaning that they point to the tabernacle, because the tabernacle is using creation as a model for how it should be understood. That God is the God of creation, and therefore we worship him. E.J. Young, in his studies on Genesis 1, says that the 6 days of creation are literal days, but they are also analogical, pointing to a deeper order and rhythm of God's created world, including the rhythm of worship. And there are those that I disagree with who take this too far, and they want to say that it's not a literal 6-day creation. This is mostly to be understood as pointing to how we should worship in the tabernacle. And remember, Moses wrote this, and Moses also wrote the parts about the tabernacle. So which comes first? The way we worship, and Moses is reinterpreting creation in light of the worship? Or is it the other way around, like E.J. Young says, God has given us creation, and we interpret our worship in terms of what creation truly and really is communicated to us as here. And I hope you can see the problem here, that there are those who are our brothers in the faith, they're Reformed, and they're pastors of Reformed churches, but they think it's appropriate to denigrate creation and call it not literal creation. These pastors will go in front of presbyteries and they will say, I take an exception to the Westminster Confession on creation. I don't believe in a literal 6 days. And they say, well, don't worry. I still believe creation's useful and true in a sense. And that's where you have to be very careful, because the doctrine of creation is very central. Even Athanasius points out, if God is not your creator, he cannot be your redeemer. And Athanasius was a pastor in Alexandria, a bishop, the head bishop in Alexandria in the early 300s. If you understand God as your creator properly, you understand him as your redeemer properly. If you don't think God is your creator in a real sense, that actually directly affects how you view God and his power as your redeemer. I believe this is a very important doctrine to understand, that we cannot merely see this in an analogical way. But E.J. Young correctly orders it. He says we have to believe the 6 days of creation are literal days, and then we can believe that Moses, when he designed the tabernacle according to God's will, that it was in a picture of God's creation. So we see that there is a parallel here between the dividing of the sea and the land and the earth, and also the dividing of the day and the night. And so we see God continue. I said you're going to see God do a lot of dividing throughout all of the scriptures. He even says you should rightly divide the truth. In Timothy, Paul tells Timothy, rightly divide the truth. And you should start thinking about these early chapters, which probably many Jews would have these memorized, the first chapters, that God divides and God divides and God divides. Well, we need to mimic God, imitate God, and rightly divide. So God is rightly dividing here, and there is a parallel between the earth and the dividing in the earth and the dividing and ordering in the heavens. The creation of the luminaries reflects the parallel between heaven and earth. God is sovereign not just over heaven, but also over the earth. God is not on vacation in heaven, and we get to have our way with the earth, and God doesn't care what you do on the earth. God doesn't care what you do with environmentalism, which Christians call stewardship. Environmentalism is an attempt for the secularists to steal away Christian stewardship over creation, dominion over creation. God doesn't say anything about education. Knowledge is a completely secular thing, and it doesn't matter what you teach your kids about the alphabet and the numbers, because it's not a religious matter. Rather, we should see that God is the God over all knowledge and wisdom, and that idea that education is purely secular is a secular idea. When Deuteronomy 6 says that we should train our children in the way of God's law and his word, He's claiming that we have a duty as parents to properly educate our kids. And so we see a sovereignty. He's rightly dividing on the earth, he's rightly dividing on heaven, and that he's sovereign over all of it. There's a comprehensiveness to his sovereignty. And the way that the heavenly bodies move across the firmament. Remember I said the firmament was like a boundary line between heaven and earth? And the way the heavenly bodies move across the firmament directly affects everything that happens, every aspect of life on the earth. The way the seasons and everything works, the sun coming up and the sun going down, that's when you go to bed. And hopefully we have manufactured light now so we can stay up later, but still we follow generally roughly that when the sun comes up, we get up, and when the sun goes down, we go to sleep, even in our modern era. So God's dominion, his sovereignty affects both heaven and earth, and I think that is a very productive way of understanding what goes on here in verses 14 through 19. That God is ruling from heaven and that he makes these lights. One of the things that I would like to point out here is that the word for lights, you may have heard in here, I've already referred to them as luminaries. The word for light, or, is slightly different from the word for lights. So the maurim, so the maurim is also derived from the word light, but it means luminaries. And this would be like a candle or a lamp. And so God is referring to these lights. The New King James doesn't really capture it. Maybe I haven't actually recently looked at some of the other translations, whether they use the term luminaries. Maybe you see in your Bible that some of the other translations capture that difference. But that's very important for us to understand that these are bodies of light. These are light-emitting objects. This isn't light in the more nebulous sense that we got in day number 1. And that's important to point out for the following reason. Remember, there are some who complain that, well, you can't have light without the sun, and God gets it backwards, and this isn't scientific. But then I pointed out in one of the first sermons we did that you can easily have light. Modern science actually shows you through chemical reactions, you can have light without the sun. And so the idea that the light is purely dependent upon the sun is not accurate at all. But we do have here the creation of light-giving objects. And if you look at the structure, which we're going to look at in the next point, you're going to see that there's a creation in 1, 2, 3, days 1, 2, 3, of the spheres, if you will, in which the 4, 5, and 6 created beings live. And so in this heavenly sphere, the sun and the moon and the stars are the inhabitants of the heavens. And then in the next days, 5 and 6, you'll see the population of the seas with fish. I'm getting into point number 2. But the luminaries, the meorot, that's not meorim, it's meorot, which is also plural. The plurals can be im or ot. So meorot are the light-giving objects that God uses, he populates the sky with. And if you find it strange, what does it say? It says, God made 2 lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night. So you kids, what's funny about that statement? What is it when it says, God appoints the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night? Have you ever looked at the sun and said, you rule the day? Or the moon, you rule the night? It's kind of like he's talking to the sun and the moon as if they're people, right? because people rule, right? Do I say my car rules this parking spot? No. And I don't usually say, because I think of the sun as an object, not as a person. But here he says that they are ruling. They're doing something you don't normally think objects can do. And also, this is language of the sun and the moon acting as servants in their roles. They're serving God. He set them to rule over the day and the night, to do these jobs. And he also sets man on earth, and man is to have dominion, right? So everything he creates, he sets it up for a purpose. And it has to do what the job that God ordered it to do. Now, when God tells you to go to Nineveh, and you don't do it, does the whole universe come apart? But if the sun disobeyed God, or the moon disobeyed God, even if the moon disobeyed God and started going into a different orbit, it would cause catastrophic problems on the earth, right? If the moon were to start moving and doing its own thing and going away from the earth, it would affect our tides. And it would probably cause tsunamis and earthquakes, right? So don't think that it's a little thing that these servants of God who are ordered to do the will of God, don't think it's a little thing that of course the sun keeps doing what God says. That's what they're supposed to do. Well, my friend, maybe you should be more like the sun, right? Be more constant in your faith and more obedient. Think of what harmony and goodness there would be in the world if you were to obey God like the sun does. So in him we have life. John 1 connects this, as we've talked about before, connects this idea of the light shining in the darkness, and the darkness not comprehending it. This is how Jesus is described. Jesus is described as this light, this force of nature from creation. And so it's always good to remind ourselves that this creation language frequently is used by John, especially in John chapter 1, to talk about Jesus himself, that he is the light of men. And that should be very reassuring. So, point number 2 is that there is this structure. Days 1 and days 4, we have the introduction of light. And then in day 4, we have the luminaries populating the firmament. Both show God's role in ordering the lights. Day 2 and day 5 are paired together. Day 2 separates the water, and day 5 fills the spaces with birds and sea creatures. And then there is the continuing emphasis on filling the spaces with created creatures. In days 3, we have the land and the vegetation. In day 6, we have the animals and the humans. There's a completed cycle there that we see that God prepares the spheres in which the created things are going to live, and then he populates them. And there's definitely a crescendo, right? Because you take the disordered chaos and you make ordered spaces out of it, and then you go from the ordered spaces that are living and acting according to God's plan of dividing, and then you fill it with all these creatures, and now there's an abundance, there's life. And that's certainly how we view the world today. We even divide things along very similar lines. Physics would be the days 1 and 4, or let's just say day 1, and then day 2 would be chemistry, the creation of matter and the ordering of matter, And days 3 and 6 would be biology, the creation of those things. And so how can we say that this isn't a proper reflection of the world? We even order our sciences the same exact way. And then just wait 10 years, somebody will come up with let's get rid of all these disciplines, and then we can have chaos in the sciences. We'll just blow up the sciences. They're too Christian. We can't have biology anymore or chemistry. That's somebody, Pastor Baumbach wrote this paper and proved how all these sciences are still under God, and it's how he created them. And we got to stop doing it this way. Let's rename all these, to give them different names and try to eliminate God. Never works. It never works to redo the order. But what I also want to point out to you, in this chiastic structure, usually what you have in a chiastic structure, you'll have a few points, and then you'll have like a few corresponding points, and you have something in the middle. Well, we don't have that. We don't have something in the middle. You have days 1, 2, and 3, and 4, 5, and 6, but there's nothing in the middle. The middle day is on the end, day 7. But if you look at all 7 days, and there's different, I do believe that this is legitimate. If you can probably search online different ways of outlining the Bible. Very interesting, because you can find different patterns. You can look at all 7 days, and you could say, well, the 4th day is the central day. Obviously, the 7th day is preeminent because it's separate, different. God rests. There's no work. But the 4th day is also different. In that it's right at the center. And we always want to pay attention to what's at the beginning, what's at the end, and what's at the center whenever we possibly can. And so in Michael Morales' book, Who Shall Ascend the Mount of the Lord, he does a biblical theology of Leviticus, which is all about the temple worship. And he points out that the temple, in its architectural and symbolic design, was intended to be a microcosm of the universe. It's a little universe, the temple. And it's a place what do we do, kids, in the temple? You go to the temple, you worship God, right? And so if the temple is a little tiny universe, what is God saying about the whole universe? The purpose of the whole universe is to worship God. Everything is about worshiping God. What is man's chief end? To glorify God, to enjoy Him forever. That's worship. Enjoying God and glorifying God. And so he says that there is a microcosm of the universe, a place where heaven and earth intersect and where the divine order of creation is mirrored and celebrated. And notice what he says here. He says, very wisely, this is a mirror image of creation. Creation comes first, and our worship is a reflection of what happens at creation, not vice versa. So he gets it right. You shall also make a lampstand of pure gold. The lampstand shall be hammered work, its shaft, its branches, its bowls, its ornamental knobs, and flowers shall be of one piece. In the temple, in Exodus 25, verse 31, he talks about the making of the lampstand, which is the luminary. It is the lamp of the temple, and it's everything in the temple inside is gilded. And it's intended to reflect the light of the lampstand. And this may be helpful for you. I did an AI image for the children's bulletin, and it would not give me a 7-light menorah. It would only give me a 9-light menorah, which is the modern Hebrew. They changed it from the biblical menorah that you'd find in the temple, the 7 light. So if you ever see a 7 light menorah, don't ever bring a menorah into your house. Unless it's a 7, you'll never find one that's 7. Unless it's a 7 light menorah, because that's the only one that we find in the scriptures. So why is the number 7 important? Well, we have the 7 days of creation, right? And there's the central day, and there's the days on the ends. Very picturesque of what we would think of when we think of creation. And this is the only source of illumination in the temple. Everything is built. Everything is gilded. All the bowls, everything is covered with gold. Has anybody ever been panning for gold? You go out panning for gold, and when you find gold, can you even tell that it's gold? When you find gold, but if you find a nugget of gold, what if you found a nugget? It's like this big. Could you tell that that was gold if you found it? What color would it be? Yellow. Bright yellow, right? Because does gold get corroded? Gold does not get corroded. It's one of the few metals that it doesn't accept corrosion. It doesn't react. It doesn't get oxidized. It remains pure, and imagine the reflection inside of the temple, that pure gold that's lining everything. It would be really remarkable. So regarding astronomy, because we need to talk about it, John Calvin says astronomy is useful in studying creation as a science, but not as oracle, so not as astrology, if you will. Rather, as types and shadows, as what Hebrews says, that all of this that came before was a type and shadow, and that even the oracles or the astronomic signs in the heavens, that they are types and shadows to point to Christ, that they do not have any significance in themselves. So their constancy reminds us of the created order and how it is reliable and ultimately useful for navigation, even if we know that, it's useful for navigation. So it's useful for so many practical scientific reasons. So this is John Calvin's view of astronomy and the use of it. And I think that's important, that we do not worship the creation. We don't see the creation as somehow speaking God's will to us. You have to be very careful about that and not superstitious. There's a whole lot of superstition in the world, and none of that is useful. So one of the things that's really important to understand, especially the connection to the temple, is that the chiastic structure really just helps you understand a little bit more detail about how the Hebrew mind communicates and how you can use the outline of the passage that Moses would have intended to help you understand creation better. Lastly, we have the question of the duty of worship. So when it says that it's for signs and for seasons here in the passage, to rule over the day and the night, but also in verse 14, let them be for signs, seasons, for days and years. In Leviticus 23 and 24, we see the perpetual ordinances and Sabbaths and the church calendar. And sometimes I'm probably a little less puritanical than some of my brothers about the church calendar. I'm fine with talking about Christmas. I don't like the term Easter as much because that is pagan, but I do like celebrating Resurrection Day. I just don't like that one little word, Easter. I don't like the Easter Bunny. I don't think he's very helpful either. But I do think that the church calendar that was set up in such a way in the Old Testament to continuously remind us about our history. And so if you're using any part of the church calendar to remind you about the history and not as a command to worship, like you're not worshiping on St. James Day or some other day, right? We don't worship St. James. We can remember the history, right? And that's good. But we don't use the church calendar in that same way. But we can, according to Leviticus 23 and 24, understand that there are certain rhythms in the creation that God has set. And these Sabbaths, there were not only weekly Sabbaths, but there were days of rest and blessing and feasting. So those were all reflected in Leviticus 23 and 24 as part of the seasons, part of the days and years. And that is important for us to keep in mind. In Leviticus 23:2, it says, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, the feast of the Lord, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, these are my feasts." And we do believe that the feasts of Israel have ended, that is a part of the time of the civil ordinance for Israel. And we don't worship the tabernacles feasts. We don't call special convocations for those days. The only days that we recognize as days for holy convocations are the Lord's Day. The Lord's Day is the number one holy day. There's no day more holy than the Resurrection Day. And that's why we even worship on Sunday to begin with. That's the whole purpose of worshiping on Sunday, as we covered in our Easter sermon. So remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, Exodus 20, verse 8. And this is referring back to, of course, the 7 days of creation. We have these, the sun and the moon and the week now given here in day number 4 in order to point us to these creation ordinances. And then in Deuteronomy 4:19, we have this warning in our worship. We should not worship God according to the sun, moon, and stars. These are merely God's creation. We do not worship a moon god. We do not worship a sun god. We do not worship a God who is merely a part of his creation, but that he is holy and above his creation, sovereign over it. Our duty is to worship the Creator and not the creation. We seek his will through his word. We don't look for signs in the heavens. So we steer clear of worshiping in the wrong way. And I want to talk quickly about how Jesus is often referred to as the rising sun. In Lamentations 3, it says his mercies are new every morning, and you should think and talks about the sun rising, right? His mercies are new every morning, and the luminaries remind us of God's constancy, and that's really this comparison of Jesus to the rising sun being the morning star. This is referring to Jesus as a part of this eternal order, not as a created being, but as a part of God's constancy in creation. It's something that we can rely upon. And that's the most important thing. Because what is faith? Is faith believing, I know the definition of justification, I know the definition of adoption, I know the definition of sanctification, I have all the catechism memorized. Is that faith? No, because most of us would be damned if that were faith, right? Faith is trusting and believing in God. Trusting in his constancy. Trusting that when he says, I am coming again, the sun is going to go down. But you have faith that it's going to come again the next day, right? Do you get terrified? Well, some of us do. My kids do, because I tell them about the Krampus and stuff that comes out at night. But do you get terrified that the sun's not going to come up the next morning when it gets dark outside? You do? You get terrified? You like the sun may never rise again? No, you don't, because you trust that God has made it so that it will come up again. We are not terrified that Jesus will not come again. We are confident that he will rise again. He has risen again, and that he is coming again. And so we also can look to Revelation where it says, there will be no more sun or moon. Why does it say that in Revelation 21? There will be the light in heaven will come from God himself. He won't have any intermediaries, intermediary servants. The constancy of God is the centerpiece of our faith. That is faith. It's not just believing. Doctrine is important. I would never denigrate doctrine. But it's believing, if you have a simple faith, I trust God with everything. I have cancer, but I trust God. My husband died, my wife died, but I trust God. My children died. We have friends who recently backed over their 4-year-old child, about the same age as our kids, in their own driveway here in Boise. Well, they're not our friends, but our friends are their neighbors. Trusting in God instead of being tortured the rest of your life because you're responsible for backing over your own child. Think how that could ruin your life. That could ruin your life if you didn't trust in God. You trust in God just like Job did. So as we look at who God is in creation in day number 4, we look at our duties to trust in him. We think about first that he is the dividing God. He brings order and light, and he has sovereignty over all of it. And he is the one ultimately who is reliable, which is why he sets his creation in a reliable order, reliable patterns, and that we can't change that. We can't change to another system. We can't say, I'm opting out, God. Even our pagans who try to do that, they have to opt back in. Secondly, when we take these passages and we outline them, and we look at the Hebrew outline, the chiastic structure, we note the different structures that we see here, we can see how God is communicating to us that his created order is all about worshiping him. His created order, the centerpiece of it, is that Jesus Christ is the rising sun. That in the center of creation, in day number 4, we have a duty to see ourselves in this church building, even in a mini cosmos. We can see the lights, the 7 lights of the menorah in the temple, and imagine coming with Jesus, the high priest, into the temple to worship and seeing the array of light and the showbread which the light falls upon, which would be a picture of the light falling upon the earth and the growing of the grain and the providing, the fruitfulness of the earth that we talked about last week. And we can also think about why we come to worship. Do we come to honor the God who rules over kings like Herod and Cyrus? I didn't even fit in Matthew 2, the Herod and the Magi and the talking about the stars and how they were used. But Cyrus also is described as the servant of God because God is the creator. Even Cyrus serves him, as we see in Nehemiah. And so, do we see the sun and the moon, his loyal servants, as part of his sovereign reign, a part of his providential care, the regularity brought to our lives? And living, nobody says, I'm not going to live in this pattern, because it is a common grace that blesses us, blesses all of us, all of God's creation. And we see this as part of the central part of our 7-day week. And we become aware that even worship, I'm actually not sure if I do think this is part of the reason why Wednesday night is often like a prayer meeting for churches, because Wednesday night is at the center of creation. And it would be logical. But even Wednesday nights, we don't see that as absolutely required as a day of worship. Just an extra blessing if you can fit it into your busy lives. So we would love for you to join us for prayer meeting on Wednesday nights, even if it's just by video. Can be a good time to have sort of an informal way of getting together and blessing each other and praying together. There's nothing better. And so the constancy of God's creation, this should cause you to trust in God and his faithfulness. And that should build up your faith. Essentially so when God allows chaos into our lives as a means of discipline, as a means of whatever it is. When chaos comes into our lives, this faithful God should be at the center of our faith. And I pray that the luminaries of day number 4 will draw you to their Creator. They will exert their gravitational pull upon your life, that they would draw you to him, that they would cause you to want to live daily in light of his glory, in the hope of the day in which there will be no sun, when you can bask only in the light of God's glory. What a wonderful thought. Knowing that there will be a day when these servants, the sun and the moon, will cease, and we will rest in the unmediated, warm, fatherly love of God in Jesus Christ by the power of the Holy Spirit. What a wonderful day that'll be.